Yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor Tanika Sarkar. This is Michael Tarakan.
Sorry?
I'm Michael Tarakan. I'm chairman of the KCHR. Welcome and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. Dr. Rachel Varghese, can we start?
Yes. Welcome everyone to today's talk. We are delighted to welcome you to today's talk Between Faith and State, Colonial Personal Laws in 19th Century Bengal by Professor Tanika Sarkar. Before we start the program, may I request all of you to please keep your microphones on mute for the duration of the talk. Kindly type in your queries and comments in the chat box. We will read it out for the benefit of the speaker and the participants. May I request Professor Michael Tarakan to please take over the proceedings.
Once again, welcome, Professor Tanika Sarkar. We are all very happy that you are sparing your valuable time to spend with us and talk to us about a very important and also a very topically very relevant subject. We are all looking forward to listening you on your talk on Between Faith and State, Colonial and Personal Laws in 19th Century Bengal. I'm sorry, I've got a problem with my throat. I'm not able to speak as easily as I could otherwise. I would like to point out to all of you who have come here to listen to Professor Sarkar that she has, of course, you all must have followed her works already. She is concentrated mainly upon religion, gender, and politics in colonial and post-colonial Bengal as well as the whole of South Asia. And she has come out with some very excellent writings, books which she has co-edited, as well as books which she has written herself. And we are very happy that people like you are here to discuss on various subjects with the seminar series that is being organized by the KCHR. And our director, Professor Arunima Gopinath, she joining us, has established a very strong link with the JNU community, research community or scholarly community. And we would be most happy to continue enjoying the fruits of such an association. Without talking more, because as I told you earlier, I have this problem of a throat problem. So I would welcome you to initiate your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's a great privilege to be here. I also have a throat problem. I took the COVID vaccine and there's fever and body ache and throat problem and so on. So if I get incoherent, please tell me that and I'll try to pull myself up. I decided to present this paper because of keeping in mind the wonderful... Sorry?
Please carry on, ma'am. Please carry on.
I chose this theme, keeping in mind the wonderful work on Kerala Matrilini that Professors Sharadamani Panikkar and G. Arunima and others have done. My presentation is, of course, on Bengal, but the material applies to much of North India and beyond. But first, an apology and a clarification. How much time do I have for the presentation?
Ma'am,
As much as you need.
That's extremely generous. I must have been mad when I wrote in the abstract that I pioneered personal law studies. What I meant is this. There has been some very important work on individual Hindu laws, as well on the entire set of Muslim and Parsi laws from Lata Mani, Julia Stephen, Mira Sharafi, and many others. But these rarely address the overarching logic and structure of the formal legal domain as such, that the British created and named as personal laws. As a result, we are not alerted to the possibilities or constraints that the legal framework threw up, nor to their larger discursive, social, and cultural impact. And we hardly notice the broader Indian context in which the legal domain was embedded and which continued to shape it, just as much as the procedure and protocol of colonial lawmaking reshaped the Indian moral universe in some respects. Once we take this into consideration, we begin to notice how this new sphere was actually driven by Indian initiatives and innovations. And we begin to mark the strange mutual entanglements between Indian faith and colonial laws. Let me briefly explain what personal laws were about. Warren Hastings published a judicial plan in 1772, which was subsequently confirmed by a royal edict of 1797 and by the Queen's Proclamation of 1858. The plan relegated the governance of faith, caste, marriage, divorce, succession, inheritance, adoption, and dower to the religious texts and customs of various Indian religious communities. Each community would have a separate set of personal laws. It also, the colonial state promised not to change anything that was inscribed in scripture and custom in these respects, nor introduce new rules of conduct until and unless accredited religious specialists certified that current practice was had been based on false, inauthentic scripture and custom, and therefore may be legally replaced with superior, instructions from scripture. Custom, that is, unwritten rules of social and ritual conduct, was also believed to be of sacred provenance and origin. Personal laws, as Lucy Carroll says, then rested on triple foundations: scripture, custom, and positive law or state statutes. And I'd add a spin. Very interestingly, state statutes were derived from Indian religious custom or text. So instead of the three pillars that Lucy Carroll has suggested, I would say there were two pillars, because state laws depended entirely on these two. Laws were derivative from and parasitic upon these other two. Mind you, this rather large-scale transfer of social control to colonized communities happily coexisted with the usual British racist rhetoric about Indian barbarism and the British civilizing mission, with reckless exploitation of Indian producers and resources. So, we need to ponder why an otherwise, exploitative regime would show a lot of tolerance for Indian, moral and social norms. We need to therefore run colonial discourses past colonial policy decisions and carefully attend to the gap between the two, something that post-colonial scholarship, especially feminist scholarship, often forgets to do. The basic structure of what the British call personal laws and what we after independence renamed as family laws is largely intact even now, though of course there have been a major overhaul in the Hindu personal laws in the 1950s and somewhat later in Christian and Muslim personal laws. But the overarching logic that strung individual statutes together has not really changed. So community laws continue to be separate, and there is some reference to religion still. All through the 19th century, Hindu personal laws provoked the most acrimonious controversies, and three were especially controversial. Regulation 18 of 1829, which criminalized sati, or burnings and burials of living widows. Acts 15 of 1856, which legalized remarriage for Hindu widows. And Criminal Laws Amendment Act of 1891, which classified cohabitation with girls, including wives below the age of 12, as rape. The first and the third statutes, therefore, migrated from personal to criminal laws. What used to be personal laws now became criminalized. A few words of introduction about these three ritual practices which were, dealt with by colonial law. Sati burnings were never mandatory. But if performed, the ritual promised heaven for 3 million years for the paternal, maternal, and matrimonial families, for the husband and the wife. And it also promised to release 7 generations of their ancestors from all sins. The ritual of widowhood, the ritual regime of widowhood, on the other hand, was absolutely mandatory. No matter what her age was when she was widowed, the widow was condemned to inflexible celibacy, permanent inauspiciousness, a very heavy load of self-mortifications and dietary and sartorial deprivations, enormously complicated load and elaborate load. Third, the Garbhadhan ritual was meant for the wife who must be married off before puberty, ideally before she's 9. And the later censuses give us quite a lot of evidence about wives who were in the 0 to 1 years of age. That is, they could be a few months old. As soon as she reaches puberty, the wife has to perform the Garbhadhan, which is one of the first of the 10 fundamental life cycle rites, and start sexual cohabitation with her husband. Otherwise, her womb is polluted and sons born to her lose the right to make offerings to ancestral spirits. Any violation of this fundamental right was compared to drinking menstrual blood or the sin of feticide. It was so dreadful a lapse. All through the 19th century, I'd argue that unlike civil or criminal laws, personal laws were not merely a matter of state, not something created by legislature and courts. They were significantly shaped by the subjects of law, by law's recipients, at least by the male recipients. Inherited religious convictions and customary practices, as well as the modern vernacular public sphere, decided much of their form and content. And unless we mark the exchange between the social, the cultural, the moral on one hand, and the legal on the other hand, we cannot make sense of what was happening in this sphere. Post-colonial scholarship tends to focus on state activism alone to demonstrate a thoroughgoing colonization of Indian traditions under the rubric of personal laws. Counterintuitively, I reverse that sequence. True to its promise, courts for a long time employed Brahmin Pandits and Maulavis to help them adjudicate these issues according to scripture, custom, etc. Or they consulted local custodians of unwritten custom. Later, they came to rely on case laws and on upper caste Hindu and Muslim lawyers. Hindu reformists, Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwachandra Vidyasagar, who wanted to change specific practices, we should note, invariably came from impeccable Brahman backgrounds, and they were, moreover, their scriptural knowledge, their knowledge of Sanskrit was amply acknowledged even by their worst adversaries. So, it was as Brahman Pandits that they could become authorized interpreters of sacred texts so far as the colonial state was concerned. The state played a refereeing function, choosing one particular version of faith against the other. So these laws are an excellent example of how the colonial state legalized moral norms that were quite alien to it. Even though we should remember that 19th century British and Indian values, gender values, were not necessarily all that different from one another. Till the late 19th century, English women could hardly seek divorce, custody, or control over property or income. Ecclesiastical courts presided over marital disputes. And in fact, Indian Muslim women enjoyed far better entitlements to inheritance and divorce than did British ones. There were then a few points of convergence, especially between the Brahmanical norms and the British ones. And the colonial state, therefore, found it easy to believe that the Brahmanical marriage regime applied to all Hindus. What did the regime involve? It involved non-consensual, indissoluble, sacramental marriages with child wives and unlimited male polygamy on one hand, and inflexible female monogamy, even for widows, on the other. The British discovered quite late that, quote-unquote, low castes followed different rules. At the same time, it's also true that by the 19th century, gender and Brahmanical gender and ritual practices had come to influence large chunks of upwardly mobile, quote-unquote, lower castes, who adapted to them in order to improve their social ranking. So this is scripture. What about custom? Custom, that is achar, babahar, was more elusive than religious texts. Being unwritten, immensely variegated, and intensely contested, it needed to prove continuous usage for at least 80 years to acquire legal status. It had three forms. Kulachar was lineage-based, Lokachar was locality-based, and Jati Achar was caste or subcaste-based. Their simultaneity created ample space for mutual contestations, as did their coexistence with scripture as a source of law. The state, in general, sought to appease the orthodoxy as best as it could, believing them to be the real custodians of traditions, and this had an interesting effect. Hindu reformers, men who wanted to introduce specific legal change to entrench gender regimes, these reformers, therefore, had to recast themselves as even better traditionalists, who were more faithful than the orthodoxy to scripture. It was, as we'll see, a rather difficult game to play. Since personal laws were caged within scripture and custom, all that modern Indians were left with was the interpretative or exegetical tactic. That is, to reread scripture and to a certain extent to reinvent custom. And this is how it went. They'd first select a specific sacred text, then strenuously establish its supreme relevance and for modern times and its supreme antiquity. Then they'd extract a particular fragment, making it conform to the specific legal change that they would advocate or oppose, dissolving the textual voice into their own and vice versa in a kind of ventriloquism. Noticeably, after the 1870s, the state stopped relying on European scholar officials altogether, and modern upper caste now produced Indian social and cultural knowledge for state use on their own terms. The three pillars of personal laws were thus filtered through modern Brahmanical readings. And the readings clashed all the time, leading to an important new development. We must acknowledge that scripture lays down commandments. What is there in scripture is its own justification. Why should we follow the scriptural norms? It's enough to say because they are embedded in scripture. Modern commentaries, on the other hand, had to increasingly justify what they proposed or opposed. They had to show that what they said was not just authentically scriptural, but also more moral and just. And that slowly made immutable religious prescriptions slightly more porous, fragile, and unstable. For instance, each reformist rereading of scripture carried seeds of future problems. Pandits, Brahmin scholars, usually upheld the Manusmriti as the paramount authority on Hindu conduct. Ram Mohan Roy, arguing against widow burnings, claimed that since Manu had maintained silence about the immolations, neither approving nor opposing, he must have disliked the ritual. Ishwachandra Vidyasagar, on the other hand, found Manu deeply problematic since Manu vehemently and explicitly opposed widow remarriage. So he offered what I find a rather customized interpretation of yet another ancient authority, Parashar Smriti, saying that in the modern Kali age, the Parashar Smriti has surpassed the Manusmriti in importance, Kalaureba Parashara. But the next generation of reformers found Parashar an impediment to their campaigns against early marriage and cohabitation with infant wives. So this whole project of liberal reform was riddled with contradictions. Personal laws also meant that certain areas of social conduct could not come under legal intervention, since they were far too well protected by scripture or custom. Child marriage, for instance, or male polygamy. Reformers had to adopt other theaters of action outside the legal recourse. So even though he wrote a passionate indictment of child marriage, Vidyasagar did not campaign for its legal abolition. He couldn't have within the framework of personal laws. But the very limits of law allowed reformists a different kind of freedom. Vidyasagar appealed to his compatriots to stop child marriage rather than to the state. He accused sacred Smriti literature of promising, and I quote from him, illusory rewards for child marriage, which creates a mirage among unthinking people, end of quote, and led them to great cruelty. Very harsh words about very holy books that he could never have uttered had he been looking for a possible change of law. Legal reform would have forced him to use scripture, not to condemn it. So liberals used public sphere campaigns to change social values as well as petitions to the state asking for new laws. They batted with both hands, if I may put it like that. Several legal historians have argued that colonial legal regimes in general, not just in India, colonial legal regimes followed legal pluralism or the coexistence of several legal orders, pre-colonial and Western. While Roberto Unger suggests stacked legal layers where colonial statutes form the uppermost level, Lauren Benton emphasizes struggles by colonial subjects to enlarge the value and status of indigenous legal norms, authorities, and personnel. Indigenous authorities, she shows, often allied with segments of colonial officialdom to push for greater cultural inclusiveness. This precluded a concentration of legal power at any definite point, but ensured instead the constant diffusion and distribution among many agents, resulting in what she calls, and I quote, multicentric legal orders, where the state was just one of the authorities. I largely agree with her for personal laws, but with two reservations. First, colonial laws were internally differentiated. Benton is talking about laws in general, but all colonial laws didn't follow the same logic. Criminal laws, as Radhika Sinha and Georg Fish have shown, were thoroughly overhauled and systematically anglicized by the mid-19th century. They were also fully codified, fairly fully codified. Even here, though, Kalyan Kumar Raman shows that new penal and criminal laws, supposedly shaped by Benthamite utilitarianism, actually contained elements of pre-colonial legal cultures. For personal laws, legal pluralism actually inverted, I think, the hierarchy that Unger and others suggest. Indian cultural norms called the tune, and the state followed them. I'd also say that while Benton uses a bifurcated legal regime, indigenous and colonial, Indian personal laws actually nested layers upon layers of textual and customary diversities, whose relative weight was never finally decided. Practically every court dispute reopened the Pandora's box, letting a whole new set of demons escape. And here I'll sort of beg your patience, beg for your patience. I want to unpack a rather tedious and messy court case to reveal the complex legal opinions that the state had to navigate through. So in 1875, an inheritance suit came up at the Calcutta Appellate Civil Court, where a widow from the Tati or weaver caste claimed her husband's property share for her son. This was her second husband, who came from the fishermen or Jalia caste, Jele caste, and the son was his. The son, she argued in court, is the legal heir, since he had performed the funerary rites for the father, and Hindu inheritance rights accrue from this ritual performance. So she invokes uniform Hindu laws irrespective of regional or caste differences. Her lawyer referred to an earlier Privy Council verdict on a very similar issue in Madras. But the court overruled the precedent on the ground that a different school of Hindu law, that is Dai Bhag, prevailed in Bengal, and the Madras example was therefore irrelevant. Now, so therefore, it underlines the regional distinctions among Hindus and complicates the uniform Hindu code, so to speak. The husband's brother, however, introduced an entirely different argument. He claimed the property for himself, even though he had not performed the last rites for his brother. He argued that according to his own Jalia caste custom, a mixed caste marriage between a weaver and a Jalia caste was invalid. The son, therefore, was illegitimate and had no right to perform the funerary ritual in the first place. The brother thus counters Hindu as well as regional inheritance rules with jati-based ones. The widow too now bounced back to jati custom, and I cite from her deposition. I quote, "He, that is the husband, forsaking his own caste, remarried me, who am from the Tati caste, according to the custom of the Tati caste." So what is she saying? She is implying that jati-specific marriage rites had transformed her husband's identity from Jele to Tati. She made jati identity an open and mobile one. She also introduced a different order of supportive evidence, and I quote again, "We were living together for at least 20 years, suggesting that the length of cohabitation cemented a valid marriage, whatever its other problems may have been. Custom, obviously, is being improvised in the courtroom. And what's interesting is that the court is taking every single form of argument very seriously. The judge reiterated that her son should inherit because under Hindu law, sons enjoy what he called preferential status over the brother in conducting funerary rites. So he tries to return once again to monolithic Hindu inheritance norms. But was the son truly legitimate and not merely a biological offspring, since he is born of a mixed marriage and of a second marriage of her mother? Even though widow remarriage had been already legalized, it was still widely perceived as an invalid act for Hindu widows. It was a massive social failure. Since the man and the woman had lived so long together, says the judge now, bypassing differences between Tati and Jele marriage norms for the moment, and I quote from him, "Marriage might be presumed." So he is now sort of moving back to the woman's argument. And he adds, since both weavers and fishermen belong to the Shudra Varna, their marriage rules should be the same. He thus translates caste as Varna, that is the fourfold hierarchical order of Brahman, Kayastha, Vaishya, and Shudra. He takes each Varna to be internally undifferentiated. He does not see caste as jati or the innumerable subdivisions within each Varna. But that found little purchase in the courtroom, and the Hindu lawyers raised even finer points of caste custom. The widow's lawyer now referred to some Dayabhaga authorities, medieval Dayabhaga authorities, who allowed interjati marriage among 15 categories of Shudra castes, and even between Shudra and untouchable jatis, though this flouted rules of endogamy, otherwise central to Hindu marriage. But the brother's lawyer argued that this particular marriage lay outside those 15 categories. But the widow's lawyer immediately discovered other Dayabhaga authorities who had apparently said that the entitlement could be extended to categories beyond the enumerated 15 ones, especially in case of very long cohabitation. So we see how different orders of legal arguments are becoming interwoven. Also, moreover, since if both litigants belong to Shudra jatis, it was possible. So Shudras are now rendered into a highly fractured entity. Mr. Mitter, the brother's upper caste lawyer, however, argued that inter-caste marriage was illegitimate for quote-unquote low castes. That would be, he said, a case of illicit miscegenation, situating the weaver and the jele as separate varnas. He countermands intermarriage among Shudra jatis under the rule of endogamy. So he is trying to establish a kind of a Shudra unity, irrespective of jati differences, internal differences, stratification. By now, the European judge has completely lost the plot, and a totally bemused Judge Markby eventually summed up very hesitantly in favor of the widow. He basically left open the larger question of defining caste, and it's very clear how caste, custom, scripture, etc., are highly interrelated and shape and reshape each other. Given such dizzyingly pluralized coordinates of identity, one understands why colonial rulers preferred transferring a large measure of legal authority, I would even say sovereignty, to accredited Indian hands. They simply could not manage it by themselves. Now I referred to 3 laws. 4 persistent themes ran through them. One was caste, as we saw. It featured often in immolation or sati controversies in terms of which caste was entitled to perform them and which could not. In practice, however, Pandits allowed all castes to perform sati, overriding quite often scriptural objections to low or untouchable castes to performing immolations. They advised the state to reward virtuous low caste or untouchable widows with the privilege of burning to death or being buried with their husbands if their particular caste practiced burials. So we see how an entire jati or a caste subfraction develops stakes in burning women. In the lower provinces of Bengal alone, consequently, 500 to 900 widows were immolated each year between 1815 and 1828, and many, many more went unreported. There were 16 cases of burying Jugi widows alive, Jugis buried their dead. Ages of satis varied between 4 and 100. And they came from all classes and castes. Surprisingly, and I have dealt with it elsewhere, even when some widows struggled desperately to escape the flames and were brutally forced back to the pyre, British judges did not punish those who had coerced her. The widow, they said, had taken the ritual pledge or sankalp to burn. So they were bound to complete the ritual. Now, in an early piece of writing, I had surmised that this is because, particular judges had some fondness for the ritual of sati, and many British people did have that. Later in the century, Gladstone, several times Liberal Prime Minister of Britain, had written an atrocious poem celebrating sati. But then I found some letters by these judges, who are saying, for God's sake, abolish this ritual, whether or not it's shastric or unshastrik. So I wondered what is going on. If they are so averse to this, why are they upholding these judgments which exempt the offenders who have actually transgressed scriptural instructions from punishment? I think, and this is a speculative point, that their legal reasoning corresponded to a particular British law, a British capitalist law of contract, the law of specific performances. Once voluntarily signed, the contract becomes immutable, even if it is fraudulent or if the signatory wants to exist from it. They saw the pledge, the ritual pledge, as an analog to the contract. Once the sati had uttered the pledge, she can't exit. The 1856 Widow Remarriage Act had allowed widows to take a second husband, but it had deprived them of a share in their first husband's property. And as Lucy Carroll has shown, low caste widows brought inheritance suits to courts, citing caste custom that enabled them to inherit their first husband's property even after a second marriage. Different high courts had different views on this. Bombay and Calcutta argued that the new law should disinherit widows of all castes if they had remarried. They have got one entitlement and they had to forsake all others. Allahabad High Court, on the other hand, invoked what they called most enabling function of law, arguing that if custom allowed quote-unquote low caste widows to inherit the first husband's property share, then they should retain that right as well as the right to remarriage. So both statute and caste custom should apply. In the age of consent agitations, the permitted age of marital cohabitation was variously computed by quote-unquote high and low castes. So caste was one preoccupation, ritual was the second. Origins, meanings, especially the precise form of immolations, began to produce heated arguments, as did the disciplinary regime of widowhood rituals. The Age of Consent Bill provoked furious debates about Garbhadhani, which I explained just now. The legitimacy of this particular ceremony. A wife just above 10 had died horrendously from marital rape in Bengal in 1889, and the Age of Consent Act was consequently introduced, raising the minimum age of cohabitation to 12 for girls, even for wives. Below that ceiling, as I said, intercourse with even wives was classified as rape. The Hindu orthodoxy claimed that this was the end of Hindu marriage, family, and faith. It organized two mammoth protest demonstrations in Calcutta in 1890 and 1891. And as I said in a recent paper published in the Cambridge Law and History Journal, this was the first ever street protests in our country and a major landmark event for emergent nationalism, extremist nationalism. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was consulted, but he, poor man, was trapped in his own earlier arguments. He had used Parashar Smriti to enable widow remarriage. And Parashar was most definitely in favor of cohabitation with child wives. So Vidyasagar admitted that the law did violate an important cardinal Hindu ritual. And in any case, he said that conjugal rape should never be classified. Conjugal rape should never count as rape. And even today, we lack a legal category of marital rape. Third, a fuzzy and inchoate notion of childhood began to acquire legal shape, as well as emotional, aesthetic, and ethical articulations. A minimum age for immolations was excavated from various scriptural sources between 1805 and 1813. 1813, though in practice the age bar was rarely obeyed. Additionally, the minimum age of the orphan that the sati could leave behind raised the question of who is an infant and when does infancy mutate into childhood, because the sati was allowed to leave behind a child orphan but not an infant one. So when does the shishu become bala? Eventually, Pandits identified 3 as the ceiling. And I think it's a very strange ruling, as if a 3-year-old orphan can bring herself up. A few Orthodox Pandits were prepared to allow remarriage for virgin and infant widows, Virgo intacta, or Akshata Yoni as they were called. Vidyasagar had always insisted that there should be no age bar for remarriage, and adult widows were perfectly entitled to remarry. But interestingly, whenever he campaigned for remarriage, his rhetoric invoked the child widow deprived of all earthly pleasure before her life had begun. Liberals described the child widow as a figure of pathos. The Orthodoxy, on the other hand, invested her with radiant purity, her perpetual innocence ensured by her capacity for self-renunciation. During the Age of Consent debates, the child bride was alternately configured as someone whose childhood is cruelly stolen by patrilocal practices far too early in life. And several British observers also played the same tune. Or as an enticingly, patrilocal practices far too early in life, Or, and here several British observers played the same tune, as an enticingly small bundle of playfulness bringing delight to a fond matrimonial home. Littleness was thus an open trope, producing both liberal and orthodox ethical imperatives. A fourth recurrent motive was female consent. Her consent to burning alive, her consent to remain faithful to a dead husband, whatever her age, her consent to deadly rape when inflicted by the husband. But consent is a profoundly ambiguous term. For Paul Ricoeur, it signifies very qualified agency, since the consenting subject is not the author of what she consents to. Antonio Gramsci ascribes subaltern consent to the effects of a hegemonic system of governance, where the hegemonized subaltern imagines that she has a real stake in the system that oppresses her. In the Indian context, however, I would say the consequences of invoking her consent was somewhat different. As two sets of rulers, state and faith, competed over her consent. When her masters actively solicit her consent, something definitely shifts within the regime of hegemony. Prodded by the state to define scripturally valid immolations, Brahmin Pandits eventually agreed that her consent to burning alive was a cardinal condition. Officials were now obliged to verify it at the cremation site and to punish infringements. As they did so, consent, which had so far been buried in scripture and was never ascertained through a formal procedure, no one even bothered to know whether it was necessary or not, became a highly visible part of the ritual sequence as well as of the bureaucratic sequence, carefully monitored, amply recorded, and frequently disputed. A significant clause 7 of the widow remarriage law of 1856, had allowed the adult widow to consent to her remarriage, even if her legal guardians, did not wish so. This was a scandalously unconventional departure, since Hindu marriage is kanyadan, gift of a virgin from one lineage to another, and the gift cannot decide on any aspect of the exchange. The clause implicitly granted her a property right to her own person, which was not really allowed by the Hindu moral regime. In Manu's words, the woman is her father's possession in her childhood, her husband's in her youth, and her son's in her old age. Never should she be her own person. Never should she be autonomous. Nastri swatantriyam arhati. In the age of consent debates, it was disputed whether her consent to intercourse should be derived from her physical puberty or from her mental maturity or from conjugal compatibility. By preventing, first of all, the burning of child widows and then cohabitation with child wives, the state reeled in the female child as its first subject, the recipient of specific entitlements and immunities. This involved a corresponding loosening of community controls over her life and death, a loss of authenticity that was fought with such enormous venom and fury that the state in every case mitigated the actual implementation of penalties. We may see this criminalization, we may call this the colonization of the Indian woman, or we may see it as a limited and tenuous sphere of immunities for her. Fitfully and uncertainly, the debates did, I think, eventuate into a nebulous, if imperfect, sense of the woman as a rights-bearing person, with something like a limited but non-negotiable entitlement to life, sexual desire, childhood. I emphasize limited, but still something. The orthodoxy in its turn reconfigured her as a culture-bearing person, the true and fearless custodian of tradition, whatever the costs may be to herself. The sati, the widow, the brutally raped and killed child wife were called martyrs. They were described as emblems of supreme Hindu female heroism. They were the true saviors of faith and the carriers, embryo of the Hindu nation of the future. Now, recently, I have been taken to task for referring to rights, which is a post-enlightenment concept. Also for using the word little for infant satis and wives because Orientalist scholars were wont to do so. Now, the charge of Orientalism is absolutely the kiss of death for any South Asian scholar. Nonetheless, for me, a child of 4, already or 10, already married and widowed or burnt, is a little girl. And having joined protests on behalf of minority citizenship rights, how can I call rights irrelevant? They may hide far more than they give, as Nancy Fraser pointed out, but on what other basis do we ask for change in value, in law, while keeping in mind the limits of rights discourses? So I end with a few consequences. Personal laws formally segregated religious communities from each other, even though in many areas Hindu and Muslim custom always overlapped. The state, moreover, helped to produce the illusion of a monolithic, non-stratified Hindu community unified by Brahmanical norms. Excuse me. This became a potent political and rhetorical weapon for Hindu nationalists about an innate organic Hindu unity, notwithstanding internal inequalities. Even in colonial times, moreover, personal laws constituted a terrain governed by Indian religions, as interpreted by Indians themselves. They enclosed, therefore, a rare and precious residual space of freedom, where Indians were free to reinvent themselves, albeit in the name of tradition. Arguments about legal change became a battleground for fractious opinion, as well as a playground for multiple social imaginaries. Over time, very large and discursive moral and discursive possibilities accrued from lawmaking. Ram Mohan Roy, for instance, introduced concepts of natural justice when he evaluated the Hindu gender regime. This has never been invoked before. Vidyasagar invoked the constitutive asymmetry in Hindu gender relations, castigating it as unnatural, his word. And I quote from him, that is widows, do their bodies turn into stone when they lose their husbands? His query is rather mischievous because widowed bodies were indeed supposed to turn into stone. But it was no longer that easy to say so in the public domain, which had by now come to articulate other social desires. Several practitioners who supported remarriage began to utter a startling new phrase, equality. I quote from the petitions, equality between men and women. Some even argued that Hindu marriages should discard their sacramental form and mutate into a civil contract. Modern literary genres, novel, drama, lyrics, polemical essays significantly broadened and strengthened introspection about faith, family, and gender. From mid-century, sorry, am I running out of time, Arunima?
No, you're not.
Okay, I'll take 5 more minutes, really. From mid-century, 1860s onwards, Bengali theatre became a powerful social actor, representing liberals and conservatives, and dramatically staging opinions for and against social change in compelling and creative ways. It crystallized as well as gave corporeal, sensuous shape to legal arguments and counter-arguments, literally turning words and ideas into flesh and blood on the stage. From the 1860s, Hindu and Muslim women began to publish angry polemical tracts, thoroughly problematizing conventional domesticity. At the same time, conservatives too reinvented themselves. If liberals put themselves across as faithful adherents of authentic tradition, conservative rhetoric tried to absorb elements from the liberal vocabulary. Interestingly, they often used a romantic language of companionate marriage and conjugal love. Love emerged as the ground for the defense of widow burnings, for celibate widowhood, for polygamy, for infant marriage. It became a new moral standard. Times were indeed changing strangely. Let me conclude with a brief reference to the Sati debates, which had kick-started legal change in the intimate sphere. Historians have somehow failed to reckon with them, and I have time just to mention a couple of arguments and counter-arguments. Ram Mohan Roy, argued that scripture demands that the sati walks free into the flames and stands there unflinching till she is completely burnt. In actual practice, though, he pointed out, she is first tied to her husband's body, then again to the pyre, then covered over with logs of wood and bales of jute, and then held down with stout bamboo poles until the burning is fully accomplished. This is not scriptural sati, he said. This is plain, quote-unquote, woman murder. He never used words like self-immolation, immolation, concremation, post-cremation. He always referred to sati as woman murder or burning alive of the Hindu widow. His opponent, orthodox opponent, Kashinath Torkobagish, admitted that the customary form of burning does violate scripture, but it was still necessary. Unless the widow is securely trussed up, she may lose her limbs while burning, and that would impede her joyful heavenly existence. How can we let that happen? Very thoughtful of him. Kashinath also used other arguments. The woman is genetically immoral, he said, so the widow was better dead. Ram Mohan replied that learning would ensure her moral strength, to which Kashinath said she was biologically incapable of receiving knowledge. And Ram Mohan asked with infinite sarcasm, when was her intelligence tested that one could conclude that she was by nature foolish? Kobe tahader buddhir porikha loilen je tahader nirbuddhi kahen. These are very new words. Such arguments are very new in our history. In the interstices of arcane scholasticism, Ram Mohan's second treatise on Shati developed a penetrating ethnographic description of everyday lives of every Hindu woman, rich and poor, high and low caste. From her lack of adequate food to her lack of education and leisure, from her grueling domestic labor and brutal punishments to her burning alive. He ruptured the classical literary tradition where the woman is either the faithful wife or a nubile figure of romance, beauty, and seduction. A deep and unprecedented sense of guilt and shame came to characterize liberal reformism. Now, is this victim narrative casting women in the forge of vulnerability? Indeed, many post-colonial feminist scholars have argued thus, assuming that agency and power are innate capabilities, always already there. I, on the contrary, think that when faced with a hegemonic, entrenched, enormously incredibly system of values, dissent needs massive conditions for its production in order to transfigure sacred prescriptions as injustice. And those conditions took a long, long time to develop. By describing immolations as a culmination of a lifetime of female suffering, Ram Mohan, I think, hoped to mobilize a moral instinct. Once made aware of its own despotism, he hoped it would translate its own rules as tyranny. He depended on what I would call a negative Hindu will. Despite the promise of untold heavenly rewards for families of Satis, most widows were actually not sent up for burning by their families. Sati statistics were indeed horrifyingly large, but they were also a fraction of the total number of Hindu widows. This proves, I think, an implicit reluctance to conduct immolations among Hindu widows. But families would not, at the same time, covertly challenge the ritual. Ram Mohan tried to activate that instinct which could not as yet name itself, nor name what it turned away from. At the same time, to persuade the state, he was obliged to reinterpret scripture and thereby give it a liberal habitation, providing it with a human face, so to speak. So his argument, passionate and compassionate though it was still a self-divided one, trying to inhabit two quite separate grounds of self-justification, self-authorization. His was a modern Hindu liberal idiom composed of contradictory possibilities. Early 19th century Hindu orthodoxy and late 19th century Hindu nationalism added other very different accents to the redefined Hindu modern. And we in India are still living with them. Now, why do we have to talk about sati or these, laws and rules? Are they not residual? I would argue not, at least not in terms of the values they uphold. The practices may have largely disappeared, not entirely though, but the values undergirding them are still quite powerful. Let me then end by reminding you about the post-Deorala predicament, when the feminists were urging for criminalizing even commemorations of satis, criminalizing the construction of sati temples, because they thought that it would, it would kind of uphold a deep sexual asymmetry. And several feminist scholars defended commemorations as a valued cultural memory that the state had no right to interfere with. Let me also remind you that as late as 2004, Anne Hardgrove had identified 25 new sati temples in Calcutta alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. May I request Professor Michael Tharagal?
So, thank you very much for your presentation. I would request Dr. Rachel Verghese, if she has already collected some names who are, people who are willing, who are wanting to pass comments or ask questions. I think we can start with that. Or if it will take some time for people to frame the questions in the right fashion and all that. Or we could have some other, a little bit of discussion between the scholar and those who are willing to participate. Whichever way you want, you can.
So we have already received a few queries in the comment box. So shall I read them out, and may I request
Yes,
others also?
Yeah, you go ahead then. Yeah.
Okay. The query that has come is from Richa Bishwas. Ma'am, thank you for this wonderful talk. You have pointed out that in colonial era, colonial court was hesitant while dealing with personal loss. Are there any example where women's opinions were taken into account in those court verdicts?
Should I take a bunch or answer to them one by one?
At the moment, we have only this particular query, ma'am. So shall we wait for the other queries to come in while you and respond to
Thank
this?
you, Richa. Colonial courts hesitated in dealing with personal laws, certainly, because the complexities of law and custom were far too formidable for them to handle with any certainty or confidence. Did women's voice count? Now, Sati, of course, cases went up to court when the woman was already dead. So it had to be evidence collected from people who stood around, the policeman or the magistrate who had attended the immolation, and so on, from the families, from friends, and sometimes even some family members and friends gave evidence to the fact that the sati had been forcibly burnt. But women's voices began to emerge strongly from mid-19th century, especially when low caste widows took their property inheritance claims to court. Hindu and Muslim widows argued strongly for property inheritance and, appeal from local courts to high courts to even occasionally to the Privy Council, which was the highest court. Once again, when we come to age of consent agitations and the consequent or even the surrounding cases of death from marital rape, once again we have the problem of the dead woman cannot speak. And nonetheless, some very badly injured wives did give evidence in the courts about how they had been abused by their husbands. And they said very, very openly that we do not want to go back. Don't make me go back. Don't make us go back. So we have some evidence. In the case of the 1889 death of Pulmoni, the child who died so brutally from marital rape, and which actually led to the making of the new law and to the amendment of the criminal procedure, her family women were extremely vocal, loudly vocal in the courtroom, and they said that she was underage, she was just 10 or below 10, she had not reached puberty, and she had been brutally raped. Otherwise, the development of forensic science around this time, from about the 1870s, 60s, 70s onwards, allowed the dead bodies to speak quite eloquently, because the forensic evidence of rape or killing collected from the dead body from the room began to be used or admitted in court as evidence. And this spoke, as I said, quite powerfully. There is, I think, another question.
Yes, ma'am. We have two short queries on the Sati temples. So shall I read them out together?
Yes, please.
The first is from Mridula Sharma. Can you please elaborate on the motives of founding Sati temples?
Motive.
Motive. Okay. And second is from Sharmishta Maitra. Can we get some idea about the locations of Sati temples around Kolkata or West Bengal?
Do you mean the older temples or the new ones?
I think this is in reference to your
final
the older ones. Yes, sorry,
it's
on the older ones.
Older ones, and that's an interesting question because in West Bengal, most of the temples were terracotta ones, and probably the Sati motifs did not survive very clearly. We have scant evidence of Sati temples or, temples with the Sati motif. I wouldn't say there wasn't any at all. Bashberia and so on, Bhatpara, they had some temples which were either dedicated to the Sati and called the Sati temple, or to, carried Sati motifs. But they were not too numerous for whatever reason. Unlike, say, Rajasthan, where lineage temples dedicated to family satis proliferated. And in Bengal, it's a peculiar thing, and Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak has already commented on this, that the sati, the act of immolation, burning, was commemorated, but the sati's name was not even known. As she went up to burn, the family couldn't even pronounce her full name, and they used nicknames or broken names which got recorded. And families carried memories of numbers of satis, but they did not mention the names, nor did they usually dedicate temples. They were very proud of the number of satis. Every year they would burn so many lamps in their memory, but no names, no monumental commemoration for whatever reason. About the new, that's older satis, and so I see one other question.
I have two other queries, so shall I move on to them?
Yes, please.
Yes. The next is from Nitin Sinha. Thanks a lot, Tanika. This is more a historiographical question on our understanding between law, state, and society.
Sorry?
Law, state, and society. Law, state, and society.
Yes.
We have, on the one hand, the framework of quote-unquote legal despotism attributed to Sinha, who also does argue for the significant role of law in making quote-unquote domestic more domestic. On the other, we have Benton's rather spatially formed framework of quote-unquote legal pluralism, which definitely needs revision. Between these two frameworks of despotism and pluralism, where would you place your observations?
Nitin, I already asked, I thought I had made myself clear that I am definitely, I would advocate legal pluralism, though I think in this version, in my version of legal pluralism for personal laws, I'd go further than Benton in asking, in arguing that there was a different kind of hierarchy with Indian commentaries and scripture and custom occupying the topmost place, not just multicentric legal order. Radhika Sinha has mostly talked about criminal laws, and which were anglicized and overhauled, and extending that logic to domestic laws. She sees that lawmaking itself is an act of despotism, and it makes the domestic more domestic. Now, in certain senses, in my findings, it would be correct, because the widows lost their property inheritance titles, and that made them hesitant about remarriage in many cases. But I would say, from the Bengal evidence that I have, it was impossible to make the domestic more domestic. It simply couldn't be more domestic. And if you want me to elaborate on this, I would. So I would say, in a very limited, hesitant way, law created more openings than it created closures.
Thank you, ma'am.
And Lakshmi, I think.
I think we have one query before that. It's from Keshav Bansal. My question is regarding a recent essay trial. The Chief Justice has been much criticized for his "will you marry her" suggestion to the under trial. Is the judge's reasoning derived out of a colonial law or social Jadi/caste Hindu custom, or is it plainly misogynist?
In some ways, I think, as I said, in some ways, British and Brahmanical reasoning would occasionally converge. And both would see, in the 19th century, both would see the raped woman as tainted and violated to a greater or lesser degree. But the physical what shall I say, the physical violation of the woman carried a far greater weight in Hindu norms, in Hindu scripture, in Hindu norms. The penance was extremely severe. She would be castigated or relegated to the realm of castelessness and untouchability. So the recent SC trial verdict, I think, carries that forward, that the woman is, since she has been violated, she is, socially dead, so to speak. And the only way to bring her back to life would be to make the man who violated her marry her. So that would give her some status according to a very, Hindu Brahmanical understanding, which would, no matter what it means for the woman to live with a man who had violated her. So I have not found so far in colonial, I'm not looking at rape cases in general. I'm looking at rape cases connected with age of consent. And there the husband is the rapist. So this particular problem doesn't arise. But I don't think the colonial judges, they did all sorts of things. They were, really bending over backwards not to offend Hindu sensibilities, but to ask the raped woman or the rapist to marry the raped woman. I don't think they would have seen themselves as authorized to do that either. But as I said, in these cases, in these kinds of cases, the judge would follow the advice of either the Hindu Pandit or the upper caste Hindu lawyer.
Thank you. The next question is from Lakshmi Subramani. This was a fabulous talk, Tanikadi. I'm curious about the moments of transition between the late Mughal dispensation, wherein Hindu women deployed the Sharia for their inheritance rights. What happened to this space under early colonial dispensation? And secondly, what has been the implications of the colonial legacy for us today?
For?
The implications of the colonial legacy for us today.
Yeah. So I missed the first point, moment of transition from Mughal to?
Moments of transition between the late Mughal dispensation, wherein Hindu women deployed the Sharia for their inheritance rights. So, Subramanian is asking what happened to the space.
Okay, thanks. So this is really beyond my ken, Lakshmi, I'm afraid, and I am yet to read Nandini Chatterjee's new work on Mughal laws, Mughal gender laws. About Shruti, as V.N. Datta has shown, Akbar and Shah Jahan did try to, they did go around the cremation sites and tried to prevent Shati. And Akbar published an edict saying that, not ordering, but saying that, do Hindus need their women to burn in order to go to heaven? What kind of custom is this, or what kind of practice is this? But they would not lay down a law prohibiting it. And they didn't bother about any other aspect of Hindu gender practices. So I would say that as in their early revenue settlements, so in their gender handling, there is a continuity between the late Mughal state and the early British state, or even the late British state. A difference came in, a transition occurred in the early 20th century, and only because now Indian legislators were being elected to the assembly in quite a few numbers. And they, being Hindu or Muslim, carried weight. And they had the confidence to step beyond the remit of scripture and custom. And that was very evident in the Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1929. The colonial state didn't have that confidence. What is happening? What is the legacy for us today? That's a very troublesome and tricky question because I think the state now being an Indian state, an independent sovereign Indian state, carries much more confidence, much more certainty, much more sovereignty to make laws in this highly sensitive and complex region than the colonial state would have had. Let's remember that the colonial state was not a settler state. So it was a very small state, as Indivar Kamtekar statistics show. You know, police thanas were situated every 200 miles or so. So they could not offend Indians beyond a point in this respect. In their self-interest, they would exploit Indian resources and producers, but this they would rather leave alone. This state, the post-independence Indian state, is not like that. It can do far more. And which way they will go is still, they have refused to consider homosexual marriages. They have refused to gay marriages. They have refused to consider marital rape, saying that Hindu husbands do not rape their wives. So let's wait and see. And there is often talk about uniform civil code. I think we should ask the state or the government to publish what kind of uniform civil code they have in mind so that we can engage with that as feminists. And we should do that immediately.
Thank you, ma'am. The next comment and query is from Professor G. Arunima. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, Tanika. The infant and the child, usually female, seem to have strange kind of legal subjectivities, in as much as entering law in the context of marriage as an age of consent or murder, infanticide, but clearly don't seem to have the potential to grow into fully autonomous legal subjects. So to the extent they seem to be closer to sites of legal discourse, as in Lata Mani's Sati formulation, than the Sati herself, as you have argued. Do comment.
I completely agree with the first point. And that is why I keep on saying that whatever little openings the colonial state provided was highly limited, highly contradictory, highly constrained. Completely agree with that. I did not catch the second point. Could you repeat it, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Rachel, do you want me to just say that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the point that I'm making here, Tonika, it's a continuation of the first point itself, which is that, your argument about Sati is very different from Lata Mani's argument about Sati, right? I mean, yet, both for age of consent and for infanticide, the way in which the child or the infant girl seems to come into law seems to be closer to the way in which Lata Mani has argued about Sati rather than the Sati herself, right? So
what do you mean by rather than the Sati herself?
Meaning I'm with you on your reading of the way in which, because she sees the Sati as really the site of these different kinds of contestations in the colonial period, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
Whereas you have historicized that in a very different way. That's a very different reading. So interestingly, we don't seem to be seeing anything more, and perhaps we can't, of the infant or the child. So they are lying around in this way within law. I mean, we encounter these very young, not female, non-person legal entities in some sense. There's something peculiar about it. And the way in which the law, colonial, the company and the state law is very obsessed with that. So, where would you want to take that? The way in which the infant, the child, the way in which they are present within law. Is there something more we can do with that?
Yeah, it's a continuation of your earlier question, and as I said, I fully agree that the state entitlement stopped really, really short of a full, rights giving, or giving the woman or even the child something like rights. So I called it something like rights, not full rights. In an old article, have called it something like rights. But to legally anchor her life for a part of her lifespan was a very small tentative beginning somewhere. And as I said, discursively, it led to a lot more openings. And that brings to me to a point that I did not fully make, that we need, in case of personal laws, we need to read laws not simply by the letter of the law, but in terms of the social, cultural, moral impact, repercussions, consequences that they have. And because of these, let's say small scale, timid, frightened legal debates and the frightened baby steps that the colonial state allowed.
മീറ്റിംഗിലിരിക്കുകയാണ് കുറച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് വിളിക്കാം.
Sorry, the state could not do very much. Did you say something? I'm sorry, I missed it.
No, ma'am.
No.
Okay, so the state could not do very much, nor could the reformers do very much, until the situation changed for Mrinalini Sinha has shown it. There was a robust women's movement that coincided with the unfortunate, pretty imperialist arguments of, what's her name? Catherine Mayo, and also also a much more liberal mass nationalism that emerged under Gandhi and Nehru and Bose and so on. That changed the situation, and people could ask for far more. Otherwise, that's what Lata Mani does not take into account when she criticizes Ram Mohan for really invested in religious reform and using gender as a site for that. She does not look at the language of Ram Mohan. She does not see how much the second treatise, and I wish I had the time to quote from it, how much the second treatise is creating a literary and social genre, cultural genre, that is absolutely unprecedented. When in our history did men say, oh my God, what have we done to our women? And we should be thoroughly ashamed of it. And secondly, she does not reckon with the steel framework of the personal laws. What made Ram Mohan depend on scripture, and when does he entirely depend on scripture, and when does he feel confident about talking about moral issues? When he's speaking to the British public, and she cites the 1830 pamphlet, which was published in England and which was meant for an English audience, a readership. He is relying entirely on scripture because he knows that the state would not entertain any other argument. And when he's writing the second treatise, he goes into scriptural exegesis, but he also talks about other things with incredible passion and eloquence. So what the steel framework of personal laws did to the prospects of reform in the 19th century is not really reckoned with.
We have one more query. It's from Murshid Alam. Could you please throw some light on the colonial state's position on the Muslim personal laws vis-a-vis the Muslim women and its continuity and discontinuity in post-colonial India?
Not my area, I'm afraid, but Gail Minault and Julia Stephen have done excellent work on this. And it's amazing how from the late 19th century and certainly in the early 20th century, a complex alliance drives Muslim legal reforms forward. Whether it's khula divorce or it's property entitlements or moving away from legal to social reform, it's a combination of what's conventionally called, I don't like the term, Muslim separatism as embodied in the Muslim League and in Jinnah, who asks for a change in inheritance laws in Punjab, in customary inheritance laws in Punjab, in the name of scriptural laws, because scripture gave better inheritance entitlements to women. So his arguments combine two things. One is that Muslims must not fall prey to Hindu norms, must not have a shared code or a shared legal situation, which in Punjab being rather exceptional, Punjab Sikh, Muslim and Hindu inheritance norms for farmers more or less overlapped. And he said, no, we should segregate. But in the process, he introduced better property entitlements. Simultaneously, women are extremely, powerfully instrumental in asking for and outlining legal reform and, using scripture for that. So there's a lot of very, very good work, and especially from Gail Minault and Julia Stephens' new work is entirely on Muslim personal laws. It combines case studies with legal agitations or agitations around law. So there were demands for better divorce possibilities and property inheritance possibilities for women. And very soon Muslim women were driving the campaigns.
There's a query from Pemo Yolmo. Thank you, Professor Tanika, for this wonderful talk. You mentioned that Rajaram Mohan Roy referred to sati as murder. But is it possible that widows would have wanted to die rather than live a life of utter vulnerability as widows?
Thank you indeed. Later on, widows themselves were saying or writing that, why did you save us from burning if you condemn our lives to such deprivations and humiliations and mortifications? And it's very surprising that those who campaigned for widow remarriage thought nothing of altering any aspect of widowhood, of the widowhood discipline. So either you marry and move from one man to another, from the shelter of one man to another, or you live, that kind of life where every fortnight you have to fast without a drop of water, even if you are dying of thirst, and even a drop of medicine was forbidden. So nothing of that was touched. As for willing immolations, willed immolations, of course, there were scores of such cases. And, we hear very often how widows would burn their own fingers to prove their resolution to burn altogether. Though, till one is burning, one just cannot possibly know what it is like to burn to death altogether. It's one thing to burn our finger. We have often done that accidentally, but actually to burn to death is a very different matter. And we have plenty of court evidence that widows who were insisting on burning, once they are placed on the pyre, somehow they broke free and managed to, tried to escape. And they were pushed back into the flames repeatedly. So we have a son falling on his mother's feet and pleading with her, "Don't leave me an orphan." But once she's on the pyre and she's actually trying to escape, it's he who pushes her into the pyre. So we do not know how long the resolution lasted, and police officer after police officer complained that once the pyre is lit, he is continuously poured into it and it emits such dense smoke, you just cannot see her last gestures. Whether she is tranquilly lying there or if she is trying to escape. Now, the funny thing is when Ram Mohan says that the Shastric form is that she walks into the flames and stands there unbound and unflinching, Kashinath, his orthodox adversary, doesn't dispute that, nor does he take up the challenge. Okay, I admit that it is not the Shastric form and Shastra should be held above custom. But so now let us take that option, let her walk free and stand there. But he doesn't take that option. So it seems that there's a failure of nerve somewhere. And he uses the argument that she needs to be bound to the pyre because otherwise her limbs may fall off. Life in heaven would be meaningless. So there is a question mark somewhere. It could well be that some widows till their life was extinguished, and that's how they have been represented. Tapati Guha Thakurta had analyzed Nandalal Bose's famous painting of Sati, where she's sitting, her body is melting away and she's sitting smiling in the flames, and she's certainly not bound. This is how she was represented. But actually, it might have happened, but it also didn't happen in a number of known cases.
Thank you, ma'am. We have come to the end of questions and comments.
Thank you for your patience and for your beautiful questions.
Professor Tarakan?
Please unmute
So your microphone is on mute.
Michael, you're muted.
I'm trying to, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Professor Thanigek, thank you very much for your very excellent presentation. I have a very small doubt. I was wondering whether in your presentation of the intersection of religion, gender, and politics, was modern literacy and education and its development or lack of development in certain regions also has played a role in lawmaking, in the sense that I thought I heard that you've been implying that quite a bit of points for interpretation of the colonial law came from scriptural, local, as well as jadi-based customs and understanding. I'm asking this question because in the southwest state of Kerala, where there were two princely states and a portion ruled directly by the British, you had this very interesting development of fairly good growth of literacy and primary education right in the second half of the 19th century itself. One argument is that with the rise of modern education, with its Protestant Christian influence on, whatever, that was most of a liberating kind of an influence, and that had worked in favor of laws being developed in favor of women as well as other sections of the community which were deprived. The other is that those who gained literacy earlier than the others, they were able to become the interpreters of the traditional law. And they became a stumbling block for the other groups, I'm saying the most deprived or socially backward kind, socially group, to get the same kind of rights, I mean, just as others have. So on the one side, literacy can be a favorable factor. On the other, it could also be a kind of a intimidating factor. I mean, some evidences are available in Kerala. I mean, I was wondering whether something like that is also applicable in Bengal. I mean,
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, literacy, as you said, I'll take your second part first. The Brahmins or the upper castes, and Brahmins really for scriptural matters, they were the authorized interpreters, and they created, or at least most of them created, a stumbling block. But what was happening in the course of the 19th century, and in fact, it began with the Sati debates, around the time of the Sati debates, was the simultaneous growth of Bengali vernacular prose writings, which were more accessible to the ordinary reader, and print culture, which made scripture, and the two together made possible the translation of scripture and reached it to common people, who then began to comment on them in various ways, interpret them in various ways. So about 25 new newspapers came up, centrally arguing about Sati. And it allowed the first public debates in our history, I think, open public debates. So the development of Bengali prose in the early 19th century and of Bengali print around the same time, coinciding with this urgent interest in the new laws, opened up the public sphere to a much larger range of participants, lay participants, non-Brahmin participants, even a few subaltern participants. And later in the century, really after the widow remarriage discussions, because I think the first Bengali woman to publish her writing was it happened in 1859. So shortly afterwards, women also enter into the domain of discussants. And that certainly, I wouldn't say push the debates in one particular direction or another, but it pluralized the debates. It pluralized the opinions. It pluralized also education about knowledge about what scripture was about, what other cultures were about, how different people were arguing about these things, because arguments had been there, debates had been there, but it would be restricted to the circle of pundits. Something that for pre-modern times, say, Rosalind O'Hanlon has worked out very well for Maharashtra. Now this became far more enlarged and became more and more enlarged through the course of the century as education spread. And as a few women also entered the fray, so to speak. And there was a debate, even Ram Mohan was hesitant at first when he started translating scripture and printing them. There was a debate whether it should be done at all, because print was handled, the printing machine was handled by Shudras. So would Shudras be allowed to handle the printing of sacred literature? Would not that pollute scripture? And Ram Mohan initially said, no, they shouldn't. Later on, he changed his mind.
Thank you. You know, I was highly impressed by the kind of work, say, for instance, by Professor Nabindra Dev Sen on women's Ramayanas, talking about women's own interpretation of the so-called epic story. It gives an idea of the kind of impact that when you shift your lawmaking ingredients from orality to literacy. I think it makes a major shift in the. So thank you very much for your.
Professor Taragan, in fact, we had a query that came up just before we ended the question answer session, and I missed that. So can I please read that out before?
Sure.
Yeah. So this was to follow up from the previous query about is it possible that widows would have wanted to die? That query. So it is from Huda Said. The previous question urged me to ask this question. When we watch a movie like that of Padmavat, to which the Johar was glorified, feminists have strongly spoken against it. What would be your take on this?
Yes, as a feminist, certainly. And I would say as a human being also, I would certainly be opposed to the Jauhar that Padmavat so lovingly displayed and very skillfully displayed. Also, as a historian, I would oppose that film because, as Ramya Srinivasan has shown, Alauddin and Padmini did not even live in the same century, and we don't even know if Padmini was actually a historical figure or not.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So those are the questions that we have.
Thank you for the wonderful questions. Made me think a lot. And
Professor Taragan, shall we bring the session to an end? Sir, your microphone is on mute, sir.
Why don't you say a formal word of thanks?
Thank you very much, Professor Sarkar. It's not just formally. And we are very, very delighted to have had you on this KCHR platform. It was a deeply engaging and thought-provocative lecture. And I also thank all the participants for being a part of this program. Thank you again, Professor, and we look forward to all of you being with us in our next events.
thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful questions and patience with me. I really enjoyed this.